Welcome back. Joining us in the studio is Khaled Khalafalla, an award-winning stand-up comedian who's repeatedly performed to local and international sold-out audiences and has acted in numerous film and television productions, including Ali's Wedding and ABC's Middle Bogan. So I know you're on a national stand-up tour. Thank you so much for coming on the show.
I'm delighted to be here. Thank you for having me.
Tell me a bit about where you grew up and how you got into comedy.
I had a very eclectic upbringing. So I was born in Saudi Arabia. I lived in 3 different cities in Saudi Arabia, 2 years each. And then I moved to New Zealand and I lived in Auckland and then down in the bottom of the South Island in a place called Invercargill, then back up to mid-North Island, a place called New Plymouth. Then I went to Queensland, Australia. I went to Townsville, lived there for a year, came down to Bendigo on the outskirts of Melbourne, and then came into Melbourne for the last 8 years, I think, yeah. And that's where I started doing comedy. I initially had a journalism background. I was studying journalism, but I started hanging around with one of the journalists who was doing the radio beat at the time, and he went and he introduced me to a lot of people who were doing radio. I got introduced to that world. I really fell in love with entertainment. Someone told me that the best way to get into radio was to do comedy, because you can broadcast, edit, direct, and produce your own stuff, and you get an immediate reaction, and it's something that's highly regarded for everyone in the entertainment industry if you know how to do stand-up comedy. So it was a means to an ends at the start, and then I did it, and I just really enjoyed it and stayed there.
Yeah, well, I'm glad you did. So do you have a particular process for writing new material?
Yeah, I've thought about this many a time, you know, what my process, there's just no it's just so haphazard.
Really?
You know, I always have in my head that ideally it would be like there's a story building phase where I'm just experiencing things and I'm reading different things and I'm reading books and I'm getting new ideas. That's the harvesting stage. And then there's the, you know, the writing stage where I try and structure something out of the experiences that I've just put myself into. And then there's the testing out phase where I'll go on stage and I'll do, but you know, that never happens. It's just always I come up with an idea, I go on stage, I test it, it fails, I go back, I try it again, I go on stage, I do it again. While I'm doing that, I read something that that inspires me to say something else, and I do that. And sometimes I watch someone else's creative work, and I you know, they push a boundary that I didn't realize I could do. You hear a sound, you hear music, you have a conversation with someone, just all sorts of inspiration, all at different times, and you just go on from there.
Yeah, that's awesome. That's brave to try it out in an audience for the
I'm
first
very
time.
brave.
Yeah,
I'm
very brave.
Very courageous.
What are some of the most challenging and rewarding aspects of stand-up?
It's one of the only jobs where everyone knows, I imagine actually in your job as well, what you're doing now, a lot of people can tell whether or not you're good at your job because they're looking at you while you're doing your job. If you're an accountant, sometimes only the client that you meet on a case-by-case basis will be able to judge you given their experience of you in that immediate moment. But if you're a stand-up comedian, you're doing live audiences, if it's filmed especially, if you're doing specials, if your aim is to try and reach as many people as possible, if you're bad at your job, everyone knows you're bad at your job. And if you're good at your job, everyone knows you're good at your job. So it's both, the exposure is the good and the bad thing, I think, about stand-up comedy.
So you're a Muslim and Arab background. Have you ever encountered any negativity about that?
You know, without becoming too philosophical about it, I think right now, as a Muslim Arab, more than ever, I think the narrative of being a Muslim Arab is very important, and people are really yearning to hear that story, and there are a lot of platforms for that story, more than any time I think in recent history, or in recent memory at least. And so having that platform is really great. And it's really great to be me at the moment and have that unique perspective. At the same time, though, it's easy to fall into the trap of having to play into the existing narrative that people want to hear. So while I have a very unique story that I can tell, there is also a story that I have to express my story within. The narrative exists already for people like me, and for a lot of other Arab Muslims who are in any art form. And so the challenge is to try and push through that and find your unique perspective, and be able to create something that resonates with other Arab Muslims, rather than to try and create the story that you think the structure demands of you, which then just creates a cycle and you're not creating anything new. You've just become part of essentially the colonial perspective of Arabs is. And that's something that I struggle with all the time, pandering to the crowd and saying what I think is going to get the laugh, which is what they already know and what they already expect the narrative is. Or am I pushing boundaries, making people a little bit uncomfortable by telling my most authentic story.
Yeah.
So that's, I think, the most pertinent thing that comes into my mind about being an Arab Muslim comedian.
Yeah. Well, I've watched your work. You're doing well at that.
And do you like it?
Yeah.
Well, you come
I
to a
think
show?
you're funny, yeah.
Okay, good. Yeah, no, I
of course.
appreciate
I'll come
it.
to your show this week in
Because
Melbourne.
I'm doing a show Saturday.
Oh,
I'm not
time for
sure
the
if
plug,
you know.
yeah.
Can you let everyone know? Just everyone. I'm doing a show Saturday at the Comics Lounge in North Melbourne.
North Melbourne. Got you.
www.frontiertouring.com/Khaled Khalafalla. If you're interested, I'm not sure. Are you
If
busy?
you're
You're
interested.
doing another thing?
We'll
Season
add
3?
that link at the
All
bottom
right,
of the
okay.
screen, don't worry. So keeping with that, you've performed in the Middle East, right?
I have, yeah.
So how do you compare performing there to performing here? What's the audience like? What's your content like?
Well, I was just another dude there.
Yeah.
You know, like, over here, that's the thing. I'm Khaled Khalafalla here. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like over there, I was like Blake. Like I was just, I was the blonde-haired, blue-eyed dude. I looked like everyone else. So I was, you know, I was in the system there. So I didn't have to really, you know, scrupulously think about my narrative and how I'm going to express it to the people who look at me as the other through this lens of something that's been compounding over time for what they expect of me. I was just a dude. I could talk about anything there, and that was really liberating. But you know, for upbringing in Australia, you take for granted that you're not part of the privileged majority, and it doesn't affect you in the way that you think it would because you don't realize it for a lot of the time until you go and suddenly you are part of the privileged majority. And that's what happened when I was in Dubai, Abu Dhabi, in Qatar. I finally found myself in a place where I looked like everyone else, where the narrative existed, and I even found myself playing into the you know, the human condition that allowed me to see people maybe in a light that may have been below me, and you slowly fall into that trap of doing that and have to go, this is what it's like to be part of the privileged majority. You've got a responsibility to not fall into that trap and give other people a platform. So I was just the dude. I was just a dude. I was just a dude, you know.
But was it received well?
It was received great.
Yeah,
actually, it was
awesome.
really. The bigger the crowd, you know, the more electric the show. You can't deny that.
Yeah, of course. So what can audiences expect from your shows?
Recently, they can expect a more authentic version of me. I think I've been striving to be more revealing and more authentic than I have been in my shows. And I've been really trying to give myself the time and the space to create a show that I'm proud of and say something that matters rather than just stick to the schedule of having to do, for example, the comedy festival. So this is a thing that a lot of people might not know, but comedy in Australia, for example, is pretty much constrained to having to do the comedy festivals, and that's where your work is.
Yeah.
And they come at a schedule. So it's one of the only disciplines where you're on such a constant schedule to have to create your best work. And over time, it slowly loses its value and its punch if you have to stay on someone else's schedule rather than stay on the schedule of the merit of your own work. Because to put an example, if you're a musician, you don't have touring season or you don't have album season where you have to create the album by the time. Normally people have the time and the space to write what they're proud of, and then they decide when to release it when it's finished. So we don't have that luxury in Australia unless you break out of those festivals, which is exactly what I've done for this tour. I've done independent venues in each of the major cities. I'm doing Adelaide, Melbourne, Sydney and Brisbane. Hopefully next year I'll do Perth, but I decided to give myself more time and space to write the perfect show, and I finally have that in a way that I think I haven't achieved in the last 7 years. So this is the show that I think reveals the most of me, that I've given myself the time to create. And it's going to be this Saturday in Melbourne and then the following Saturday in Adelaide.
Unfortunately, we're running out of time. We're going to have to go to a break, but thank you so much for coming on and talking about your experience and your tour.
It was my absolute pleasure.
Head to our social media pages for details on Khaled's stand-up tour, which arrives in Melbourne this Saturday night and wraps up in Adelaide next weekend. When we get back, we'll share some tips from a traveller who's had a particularly unique experience in Saudi Arabia.